Hi, Jared.
Hi, Max. Good to see you.
Thank you for agreeing to participate in this interview. Today, we'll discuss the formation of a startup studio, and I hope this content will be helpful for aspiring startup studio founders. And this will help them to understand the legal and tax aspects of forming a venture builder.
Max Pog builds a startup studio.
So, could you please introduce yourself and share your experience?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Max. I'm Jared Verzello. I'm the founder and president of Presidio Legal. We're a law firm that's focused on representation of venture-backed companies and venture investors. So, my background in a nutshell is I started my career in San Francisco working for a very large law firm called Cooley. And then I left Cooley to join a hybrid startup law firm called Atrium, which some people may have heard of. So I took Atrium through Y Combinator in 2018, went through as a Y Combinator founder, did that for 2 years. Atrium didn't work out, so we ended up shutting it down. And in the aftermath of that, I started Presidio Legal about 3 years ago. And we have about 300 venture-backed startup clients. We have about 30 venture funds that we work with, and we have a lot of individuals that we help, including startup studio founders, accelerators, incubators, and all the different permutations that you see nowadays with those entities.
Cool, great experience. So let's start first with defining what is a startup studio. Usually they're also called a venture studio or a venture builder. So all of these types are usually familiar, or they're usually similar to each other. So first, there is a core team which generates and validates ideas. And after validation of ideas, they attract co-founders to these new startups. And usually the team shares their resources between these several startups in their portfolio. Also, a startup studio could attract investments for their work for launching new startups. And these new companies, they could attract external investments. So usually a startup studio have some shares in these studios, maybe 20, 30%. And they attract co-founders which work only on these startups. So this
Yeah,
is the model. And for a startup studio, there could be two possible ways to attract investment. So first is in the startup studio, and second is exactly in those startups, in special startups.
yeah, that's absolutely right, and I agree with that. And part of the discussion today is going to be fleshing that out in detail for our listeners so that they can understand how each of those components work. But before we get into that, I actually want to just back up one step before that, because I know some of our listeners are just getting into this industry and may need even more of a foundation. So let me start by saying, what we're talking about is people who want to build companies that have the ability to grow quickly, and those companies can be sold to a buyer at some point. In some instances, those companies will go on to actually become public companies and will list on public exchanges. But in most cases, they'll end up finding a buyer, and they'll sell their company generally after 5 to 8 years of business. You'll spend 5 to 8 years building these companies, and then you'll sell them. So the kind of foundational players in that ecosystem are founders and investors, right? So obviously the founders are the entrepreneurs that are coming in. They have the idea. They're the ones rolling up their sleeves, building the company, building the products, finding customers. And the investors are the ones who are giving them capital to help their business grow, especially in the early days before they have significant revenue. And many of us are familiar with this. The thing that we're talking about today, the startup studio, is interesting because it kind of sits in the middle of those two things. It kind of does both of those roles. And because it's this hybrid role, as a startup studio founder, it's important to understand what are your relative strengths, and are you going to lean more towards the founder side of things or more towards the investor side of things? Or, potentially, are you going to be just exactly in the middle and a 50-50 split? But let me kind of flush that out for a second, which is, okay, I'm a founder of a startup studio, or I desire to be a founder of a startup studio. How do I assess what I bring to the table to understand how I fit into this ecosystem, and where do I belong on this spectrum of founders versus investors? And so I think basically there's two things to keep in mind if you're thinking about playing this role, or if you're playing this role today. One is capital allocation, right? Do I have cash that I can bring to the table and provide to these businesses? And then the second one is skills, or kind of sweat equity, right? Maybe I don't have a lot of extra cash, but I have something that I can contribute to these various projects that justifies me getting equity in the company. As you said, Matt, maybe 20, 30%. I mean, I see some startup studios that take 80% of the equity. Mm-hmm. And it depends on what services they're providing and how much they're doing. So I think that's the first thing to understand is, do I have access to capital? Am I allocating capital? Or am I really a skills-based sweat equity kind of participant?
Mm-hmm. Let's consider the case when a startup studio founder has some capital, but he also wants to attract more for the startup studio, and maybe he's going to start with his capital to launch 1, 2, 3 startups and then attract investments. So what are possible ways to structure a startup studio? Maybe it is like LLCs and c-corps, subsidiary c-corps, or some other ways.
Absolutely. So I'm going to answer the question, but I'm going to do it a little bit indirectly, because I think how we frame these questions and how we think about this is really important. And so what I recommend and what makes sense to me is I start with the entity that's going to be sold someday, right? So if you're a startup studio and you're going to have 3 projects that you're running, right? And just to make it a little less abstract, let's give some examples, right? Let's say that I'm a startup studio and my specialty, the thing that makes me valuable, is I'm a really great online marketer, right? So maybe I'm not the world-class developer, maybe I can't build every product, but I have a sense of how to market products online, okay? So you could have a couple of different ideas that you run with that. You could have a direct-to-consumer product, right? So let's say that you have some kind of a physical good, like I have kind of a new pillow or something that I'm marketing and selling online. That's one of my projects and one of my ideas. Secondly, we have a fintech idea, right? Maybe we're selling some kind of an application that has, it links to your bank account and it has some benefit for the user, right? I mean, these are wildly different businesses, right? Selling pillows and selling fintech applications are completely different. But the startup studio founder might say, I know how to market all different kinds of products, and I know how to navigate this system, and that's the value that I bring to the table, right? And you could imagine other projects that are similar that they do. Maybe there's also the third idea is they have a business-to-business software that lets you do expense reimbursement, right? So I can help businesses do their expense reports more easily, and I have a piece of software that allows them to do that. So 3 completely different businesses. Now, what I encourage people to think about is, let's look at each of those 3 businesses. If this business is successful, what we plan to do someday is we plan to sell this individual business. And for most startup studios, if one of those 3 businesses ends up being sold and the other 2 don't work out, that's amazingly successful, right? So let's say, for example, the fintech business doesn't work out and the expense software business doesn't work out, but this pillow business just really takes off, and we're just selling tons and tons of these unique pillows, and it's really big, and we have somebody who comes in that says, hey, we want to acquire your business. We want to acquire this pillow business, okay? So what happens is that is the business that's sold. Let's say it's sold for $300 million. The question that we ask ourselves is, well, what happens to that $300 million? Where does it go? Right? And so what determines that is that pillow business is going to have its own cap table. That's kind of a term of art, but what that means is there's going to be a set of people who own that business. The startup studio is going to own a chunk of that business, right? That business may have investors that invested in that own a chunk of that business. It may have employees that it's hired that own pieces of that business, but that $300 million is going to get split up and it's going to get divided. So let's just say for illustration purposes that at the time it's sold, the startup studio owns 25% of that business. That means of the $300 million, the startup studio is entitled to $75 million. Okay. So that $75 million goes to the startup studio, right? What happens to it now? Well, the startup studio has owners, right? So there are individuals who own that startup studio, and they then split the $75 million. So here's, this has been a little bit roundabout, but I think it's easier to illustrate this way, is what we want to do is we want to get that $75 million to the owners and investors of the startup studio in the most tax efficient way we can. If we don't have to pay taxes on that at all, that's ideal, right? And of course, we're not talking about tax evasion. We're not talking about not paying taxes. We're talking about tax optimization, working within the parameters of the law to make sure that we're paying the taxes that we owe, but that we're not paying taxes that we don't have to pay, that aren't required under the law. So in most startup studios that I've worked with, what they're going to do is the startup studio itself is usually going to be structured as a pass-through entity. And so the kind of common language for this is structured as an LLC. We can of course go super deep into this stuff and get really wonky with like the tax and the legal things. But the reality is an LLC versus say a corporation, those are different structures that speak to how the entity is governed, who can make decisions, who gets to decide when to sell the business, who gets to decide to take out debt, right? Those actually aren't tax classifications. Any entity that's created has to elect a tax classification. And so there's two kinds of class taxifications. There's, generally speaking, for our purposes. Again, we're going to do a slightly simplified version because the point of this podcast isn't to go, explain everything in the tax code, but to understand how it affects startup studios. So when you do a tax classification election, you're either choosing to have the entity be responsible for its own taxes, or to say this entity is not a taxpayer. All of its profits or debts flow through the entity and go directly to the holders. So you can imagine, okay, if I have a business that's a pillow business, it sells for $300 million. It distributes the $75 million to me as a startup studio. I would rather my startup studio not pay taxes on it and that I just receive my cut, right? Maybe I own 10% of the startup studio. So I get $7.5 million as an individual. I just want the $7.5 million and then I'll pay my taxes, right? Depending on my personal situation. I don't want the startup studio to pay taxes and then give me money and then I pay taxes, right? So most of the time, what we're going to do is we're going to see the startup studio formed as a pass-through entity, right? And then the individual operating companies, they're generally speaking going to be formed as corporations. And a big driver of this structure in question is dependent on your investors, right? So are you going to have investors and where are they going to invest? Because here's one of the key things is, generally speaking, institutional investors, like financial investors, like venture capital funds, they generally do not invest in pass-through entities, right? So I've just said, hey, we're often going to structure our startup studios as LLCs so that it's a pass-through entity and they don't have to pay taxes. But at the same time, I'm saying, however, large institutional investors like venture capital funds generally will not invest in those entities. So, we have to square that circle. And the way that we do that is we have to decide what is our strategy, right? And again, on this spectrum of I'm providing sweat equity or I'm providing capital, where is our startup studio positioned? If we're providing some sweat equity and some help, but really we're providing a lot of capital, then probably doing this pass-through entity at the startup studio level is not going to work well, because if your plan is to provide people a lot of capital, you're probably going to have to go out and fundraise and find other people's capital, which means you need to be able to attract investors. And if they won't invest in an LLC, that's not going to be a good strategy for you. Now, in my experience with the startup studios that I've worked with, most startup studios are providing a lot more sweat equity, right? There's these marketing experts, or they have a team of developers, or they have other kind of operational capacity and insight, which helps these businesses prove the concept and get traction very quickly, more quickly than they could do by themselves. And that's why they get most of their equity. If they're putting some money in, it's usually, a modest amount of money in my experience. And the thing to remember is those individual companies, right? In my example, the pillow company, the fintech application, the business to business software, as soon as you get traction and start to show that this is a promising business, those individual businesses are where most of the investor capital is going to be raised, typically speaking, right? So you can have the startup studio, you can incubate the companies, you can prove traction, and then now you might own 25, 35, 40% of this individual business. And within that business, often you can go out and find institutional investors to come in and put in 10 or 15 or $20 million once you've de-risked it and proved the concept. And so we have to kind of play this game of where's the money going? What's the strategy of the startup studio versus the strategy of the individual operating companies? And the reality is there's no one size fits all. It's not that an LLC as a holding company for the startup studio and then a C-corp for the operating company underneath works every time. It's very dependent on what your strategy is. And what I'm saying is the biggest determinant of that is how much fundraising are you going to be doing from other people, and where are they going to be putting money? If they're putting money into your startup studio, you may not have the luxury of doing it as an LLC, right? If they're basically saying, hey, we like you, we like your startup studio, but we want to keep an eye on your portfolio companies, and the ones that start to take off, those are the ones that we want to invest in, then you can probably do an LLC and have some tax savings at the top level.
Okay, so like I understood, it's better to create an LLC as a parent company, and then C-corps, probably Delaware, in order to easier attract money for those entities.
That's right. And again, that's because your average startup studio founder, especially your first time startup studio founder, the real service that they're going to provide is they're really going to be providing some kind of sweat equity or skill. That's why they're getting the stock, right? If they had $40 million that they can just invest in startups, they probably look more like a venture capital fund than a startup studio, right? If they're spending their time just deciding, how do I allocate this $40 million and going out and finding investment opportunities, that's probably a whole different structure, which is an investment fund. And that's not really what we're, I think, talking about today. Again, you can have elements, right, of this, and maybe an example will be helpful of some things that we see that people are familiar with. So, for example, I mentioned that I went through Y Combinator, right, and so that's an accelerator that people are familiar with. I wouldn't really consider Y Combinator startup studio, right? What they have a 12-week program. You go through their batch. They basically do a lot of coaching on on your pitch, and then they have you stand up in front of a room full of investors at demo day and present. So they have a product, which is they're basically helping you refine your pitch and then putting you in front of their network investors. But they're really a financial partner, right? They're not really, showing up every day and helping you optimize your product and helping you optimize your marketing campaign and testing and doing user testing with your clients. They provide some coaching and some guidance, but all investors do that, right? All investors provide some degree of coaching and advice. But really their product is they're providing you capital and then they're giving you access to their network. Startup studios generally are much more hands-on. And the other thing is, Y Combinator takes, 7 to 10% of the business, right? but they don't take 40% of the business, which is what we would often see for a startup studio. A startup studio, really the right frame of mind is, as the studio, I am a co-founder for this business, and I am going to have the same level of responsibilities and engagement as a co-founder. And VCs and Y Combinator and Techstars and some of these places that we're all familiar with, they can be great partners, but they're not in there as co-founders. They're not doing this every day, 5-6 hours a day, right? And that's what we expect startup studios to be willing to do.
Do you think it is possible to attract money to this LLC, so to attract some investors, angels who will put, 500K, 1 million, 2 million into LLC and being like co-founders of LLC? And then this LLC will already form new C-corps, attract co-founders, and then make fundraising for these companies?
Well, unfortunately, I'm going to have to give you my lawyer answer, which is it depends. And here's what I mean by that is your startup studio is a startup, just like any other startup, right? And so for startups that are going out and fundraising and trying to attract capital, what is the path that they go through? Because your startup studio path is going to be exactly the same. And so basically there's two paths. If you are fortunate enough to be an individual who has a track record, right? Maybe you've built companies, you've sold companies. Oftentimes, if you've built companies and raised money, even if you haven't had successful exits, but you've been able to, be a steward of other people's capital, and they've felt like you've done a good job, even if you haven't been fortunate enough to necessarily make the investors a lot of money, that creates a shortcut, right? So for people with that kind of background and track record and CV that can say, look, I've done 3 startups. I was able to raise, $15 million in my most recent startup. Oftentimes if you've raised $15 million before, like you have a network of investors. So you have people that you can go to, you can pitch them on your startup studio idea, and you have to tell them what your thesis is, right? I mean, it's just like anything else. People don't write blank checks just because you want to start a startup studio. They say, okay, you're going to do a startup studio. What are you doing? You're going to say, okay, listen, here's my background. I was at Facebook, then Snapchat for 8 years. I was a director of marketing there. I know about social media and influencer marketing better than anyone in the world. So my startup studio is going to focus on, direct to consumer products where we can leverage influencer market. I mean, that's a story, right? Like that's something to invest in because you're like, okay, I get it. There's a founder market fit. You have some kind of special insight or some kind of special skill. You have a thesis, and then you're going to deploy it. Now, if you have that really great background and you have some success and you pitch that story, you might actually be able to get initial investment. Most people, unfortunately, are not in that boat, right? Most people have to start somewhere. And so, and this is true if you're doing an individual founder, or if you're doing an individual company startup, or if you're doing a startup studio. But most people, if you can't say, look at all these wins I've had, I'm a good bet, you should back me and get in early, then what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to get it off the ground yourself. Maybe you're going to be lucky enough to raise a little bit of money from friends and family who are willing to take a bet on you because they know you, but you're going to have to start to show traction. And then you're going to be able to invest based on traction, right? So traction for a startup studio would be, hey, we've started 2 companies, right? I'll tell you, in the venture capital ecosystem, what I see for early stage companies that want to raise money is the gold standard is you choose a key metric, right? And so this depends on your business, right? If you're a social media app, revenue is not going to be your key metric. It's going to be probably new user signups or maybe, daily or weekly active users. If you're a business to business software company, revenue is probably going to be your key metric, but you have to choose what is a sensible, defensible key metric for you. And then what you're trying to do is you're trying to show that you can get 20% month over month growth for a minimum of 6 months. And so your absolute numbers can be quite small, right? I might go from selling 10 pillows a month to 12 pillows a month to, or let's say a week actually, because a month is probably too long. I might be going from selling 10 pillows a week to 12 pillows a week to 18 pillows a week to 25 pillows a week. Well, selling 25 pillows a week is not a great business. But the point is, these investors that we're talking to, they're interested in not in the absolute numbers in the early days. They're interested in the rate of change, right? Because if you can keep growing 20% a month, those numbers actually get really big really quick, right? Now, with a startup studio, the trouble is if you're trying to raise money in the startup studio and not in the individual business, you have to show traction with the startup studio, which means in my example, if I have the pillow business and the fintech business and the expense reimbursement software, if I go to investors and I show them I've started these 3 businesses and look, my pillow business is growing 30% month over month for the last 9 months, my other 2 businesses, aren't growing at all, it's hard to see how they would want to invest in the startup studio instead of the pillow business. So what the startup studio's product is, what you're pitching is, I can launch multiple projects and gain traction in multiple projects. And you, as the investor, are not investing in any single project, but you're investing in my ability to identify new opportunities and launch them, and then get a little piece of the action in all of these different things that I'm going to do. So that traction that you're looking for as a startup studio founder is, I've got to have multiple projects that are showing early stage traction. And again, I think the gold standard for each of these individual projects is those individual projects ideally are growing 20% month over month in your key metric for at least 6 months. Now, I mean, if they have to grow 20% month over month for at least 6 months, that means you might have to incubate your startup studio for a year, right? Because you're not going to be able to just start selling pillows tomorrow because you have an idea, right? You've got to go through the process of getting that supply chain stood up, right? Having the inventory, getting the marketing campaign going. And then, that might take you a few months to do that. And then you need to be selling for 6 months to show the traction. So, this is just like any other startup. It's like, oftentimes you will be doing this for a year or 2 with very little fanfare and very little attention. And then you start to have this breakout success and everybody sees you and they say, wow, you guys are so successful and you're able to raise money. And you're like, yeah, but you didn't see for the last year and a half when we were grinding it out ourselves and nobody was here. We just had to make this happen out of nothing. But unfortunately, again, if you don't have those big successes under your belt, investors want to invest in traction and execution, not in, narratives and ideas. Narratives and ideas, unfortunately, are reserved for people who can show, look at this past success I've had. Obviously, I can execute because I've done it before.
Uh-huh. So after a startup studio shows traction, for example, they already have 3 startups as subsidiaries, and they, as LLC, want to onboard an investor and get some money for their startup studio. How is this deal is structured? So how to give share, or how to say it better, part of this LLC to an investor?
Yeah. So it will depend on what the investor is. If you're very keen on raising money in the startup studio, right? And that may be a very good idea, right? Because the whole point of the startup studio is it needs to be able to provide this sweat equity and these services. So many startup studios will have, it'll start with just, Max is starting a startup studio and he's doing the online marketing stuff because that's his skill set. But over time, I have clients that are startup studios that have entire developer teams, 20 developers on the team, right? And you can allocate them or carve them up into different projects, right? We can have 4 of them on the pillow company and 6 of them on the B2B company and the rest of them on the other company. So, it makes sense that you may want to raise money in the startup studio because you can grow the services that you're able to provide over time and incubate more companies. And it becomes kind of this, growing entity that's able to do more and more. So that makes sense. If it's an institutional investor, it's probably going to be difficult to get them to invest in an LLC at the top because, again, what I mentioned was they usually don't do that. And we can go into reasons of why that is, but they usually don't do that. However, your initial investors as a startup studio probably aren't going to be institutions, right? You're not going to go to Sequoia Capital and ask them to invest in your startup studio. That's not really what they do. They invest directly in businesses. The kinds of people who invest in startup studios tend to be like high net worth individuals, family offices, people who tend to be investing their own money. And there's plenty of that capital and they can write significant checks and be excellent financial partners for you, they would often be more interested in investing in LLCs. And usually what I would see is that we would have what's called a profits interest with them. Now, this is something that's unique to LLCs and pass-through entities. So if any of our listeners have kind of worked at startups in the past and gotten like stock options or bought restricted stock, those entities, those corporations, they don't have this profit interest mechanism I'm about to describe. But basically what a profit interest does is it says, maybe you've spent 2 years building the startup studio and you've got, 3 companies that you own 40% of, and there's real value in the startup studio, right? You can go through and value each of those 40% positions. And you might say, hey, based on how these companies are doing and how they're growing, we think our startup studio, just from the stock that it owns today in these operating businesses, we think our startup studio is worth $12 million, right? So if you wanted to bring in an investor at that point, you could give them a profits interest. And what it does is it says, okay, you're going to give us some money. Maybe they're going to invest $2 million in you, right? You're going to give us $2 million. We're going to give you a profits interest for 10% of our business, okay? And then we're going to set the profits interest hurdle at $12 million, meaning we built the first $12 million of value without you. So if this startup studio gets like a $75 million return, or if we sell it someday, the first $12 million go to us. After the first $12 million go to us, then you will get 10% of whatever the upside is after that. And that's what you buy with your $2 million investment. So you can imagine in my example where we get $75 million from the pillow company, the first $12 million go to the startup studio founders, right? Or maybe you had some friends and family investors in there, right? That gave you $50,000 to start off. And so they own some of it. But that first $12 million gets split amongst whoever were those early backers and those early participants. And then, that remaining, 75 million minus the 12 million, that remaining chunk, 10% of it goes to your financial investor, right? So now they've made their money back. They've made their 2 million back plus a good return. And the rest goes to the startup studio team. So a profits interest is one way to do that. The nice thing about the profits interest is, that the investor doesn't actually have any control over the startup studio. They don't have voting shares. They don't have membership interests. So it can be a way for them to get an economic upside, but they don't necessarily have to get into the mix of how are we going to make decisions and who's going to run the startup studio. Some investors aren't comfortable with that. Some investors want to have decision making and they want to have stockholder rights. So you can just sell them a portion of the startup studio, right? And this is not, and that's not any different than you would do for like an individual investment, right? In my example, again, you could say, hey, listen, we think we're worth $12 million today based on our positions, but we're growing really quickly. So we're going to sell you, 10% of the business at a $20 million valuation. And they just come in and they own 10% of the business now, right?
Mm-hmm. I thought that there is only one way to do it, like sell part of this LLC. But you say that it is possible to make agreement that, for example, first money are going to us, you don't have any rights or votes, and you just got profits after our first part of first base.
Yep, that's right. And it really depends on the context, right? We're speaking in general terms here. I would say if I had to give guidance about what do I typically see, I would say I typically see investors coming in and buying a piece of the business, right? As opposed to doing the profits interest things. However, as I mentioned, like maybe you're going to raise $2 million and you're going to go out and hire 5 developers because in addition to your marketing services, you want to start adding some engineering services to your portfolio companies. Well, those engineers, they're going to want equity in the startup studio too, because their opportunity cost is they could go work for another startup where they get stock options. So oftentimes what we'll see is the investor will come in and they will buy just 10% of the business outright. And you'll just have a discussion about what the valuation is. Okay, it's a $20 million valuation. You're putting in $2 million, so you get 10% of the LLC, right? Oftentimes with new hires, we'll give them profits interests because the nice thing about profits interest is you don't actually have to pay cash for it. we can just give you a profits interest and say, hey, we just raised $2 million at a 20 million valuation. So we're going to give you a 1% profit interest with a $20 million hurdle. Doesn't cost you anything, but now you know that you get some upside, because if you come in here and help us be successful, you can capture some of the ownership rights of that. So, but you could do either way, right? You could have a new hire buy a percentage of the business, or you could have an investor potentially get a profits interest. And that's something that, based on this kind of facts and circumstances, you need to work with your advisors in your particular circumstance and identify what's best depending on kind of all the context.
Mm-hmm. Does it matter where to found this LLC? In what state? For c-corps, it is a standard like Delaware, but for LLC, would it be Wyoming, California, Delaware, or how to make decision for choosing a state?
Yeah. So
especially if a team is remote and if there are maybe several founders of this LLC.
Right. Yeah. So the short answer is any entity that you think you're going to raise money in, right? And I already mentioned some startup studios don't raise money in the startup studio, right? They just do sweat equity at the startup studio, and then they go out and raise money individually in each of their projects or their portfolio companies, right? So it depends on your strategy, but any entity that you want to raise money in, you're best off being in Delaware. And it's actually very simple. You have to imagine you're raising money from somebody, right? Let's say you're raising money from a family office and they have 50 investments, right? They have a portfolio of 50 investments they have to manage. It's very difficult if 10 of their investments are in Wyoming, 15 of their investments are in California, and 25 of their investments are in Delaware, because all of these states have different laws, right? There's different rules on how you deal with the board and how you have stockholder meetings. And so if you're a manager of a fund or you have a lot of investments, just for simplicity, you're saying, hey, can we all just go to Delaware so that I know what the rules of the road are? And as I'm dealing with all my different portfolio companies, I'm operating under the same set of expectations. That's why so many businesses are in Delaware, right? Because it's easier for the investors to manage their portfolio. Now, if you're a startup studio that's thinking, hey, I just don't really have access to capital, I don't imagine raising a lot of money in the startup studio, but if one of my projects starts to take off, then we can raise money in that individually. Then there's less need to do your LLC in Delaware. If you live in California, you can save some nominal fees. You could probably save about $800 a year by doing your LLC in the state in which you live. And that's fine. And again, if you're not going to have investors and it's just you and a co-founder or a couple of people who own the LLC, there's not really much to manage. You're not having to worry about, what are all the rules for all my portfolio companies? So it's not as big of a deal, and it can be slightly simpler. If you're abroad and you don't live in the United States, I would recommend Delaware. The nice thing in general, what I would recommend is I would always recommend Delaware. Again, like I live in California, right? If I have a Delaware entity, I have to pay the kind of filing fees every year for the Delaware entity, which can be about $400. And then I have to pay them also in the state in which I live. So I'm going to incur an extra $400 of cost. But the nice thing about Delaware is it's a very digital state, right? So you have to interact with the state. You have to make filings. You have to do things. In some places like California, you have to sign things by hand and then scan them in and either mail them in or email them in a handwritten signature. In Delaware, you can do digital signatures. So I can use, DocuSign, and it's much more modern and much more digital. So especially for international founders, that kind of digital savvy interaction with Delaware is great, because it's just going to save you a lot of time and expense and headache. And you've got to choose one of the 50 states anyways. So you might as well choose the one where you can also fundraise from easily if you have that opportunity.
Could you say something about Wyoming?
So some people are interested in Wyoming, and it's, I think, getting more popularity. I'll tell you that I'm not super familiar with this, so I'll just say, take this with a grain of salt, right? Because obviously, people have different expertise. But my understanding is that Wyoming state law is trying to make itself very friendly for Web3 and crypto companies. And by, right now, one of the biggest issues with operating a crypto or Web3 based business, blockchain based business, is that a lot of the laws and the regulation just don't contemplate the way that these businesses operate and the nature of these businesses. And so Wyoming, I think, is making some moves to try to clarify things and give people peace of mind around that. So if you're a startup studio that has a Web3 focus, it might be worth looking into that. I will say in my practice, I deal with a lot of Web3 companies. I deal with a lot of Web3 companies that have raised significant amounts of capital from sophisticated institutional investors. And I have never personally seen any of them being Wyoming. So if this is a trend that's growing, it's at least outside of the scope of what I'm seeing people do. But that doesn't mean it's not something that we should pay attention to. But I would say, in my experience, it's by no means, the norm or even something that is happening often enough where I'm seeing it on my radar in my day-to-day practice of people who are actually fundraising.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is the proper time to form a new subsidiary company? Because most of ideas they will shut down all
Right.
the startups. So what is proper time to form a c-corp when validating those ideas?
Right. So the vague answer is, the earlier the better. But your point is well taken, right? Because you might test 10 ideas and only one of them gets enough traction where it makes sense to stand it up as a separate business. So if you set up a new entity, I mean, basically every time you set up one of these new entities, there's pretty streamlined ways to do it. But in my experience, it's very hard to set up a new Delaware C-corp and not spend $1,500 to $2,000, right? I mean, just the filing fees alone for the Secretary of State's office are like $400. So, and then almost always you're going to need some kind of third-party software that's going to charge you to generate the documents. Oftentimes you're going to have some kind of legal advice. And so I know just in my experience, when I'm setting up brand new companies and it's just plain vanilla, there's nothing, customized about it, it's very hard for us to do it for less than $1,500. And I think that's actually a very, competitive rate. So it would be a bummer to spend $15,000 setting up 10 entities and then only have one of them actually turn into a real project. So I don't think you need to just immediately set up a company as soon as you have an idea. Now, that being said, the point of these businesses is to sell them someday, right? And so you have to be aware of two things, which is when you sell the business and you own stock in that business, again, we've got the pillow company, the fintech company, and the SaaS company. When I sell the pillow company, ideally, when I sell that business, I've held the stock of that business for at least a year, so that when I sell the stock, I can get long-term capital gains tax treatment. And just as a quick reminder for everybody, all of us, go to work day to day, probably, many of us collect a paycheck. And when you get your paycheck, you're paying ordinary income tax in most places, right? And in the United States, ordinary income tax rates are anywhere from 10% to 37%, I believe, right? Long-term capital gains is a different tax system. It's the tax that you pay when you sell assets that you've held for at least a year. And generally speaking, California has some exceptions because California has extra taxes that they like to apply. But generally speaking, you'll pay 20% taxes, right, when you sell a business. So if you sell a business and you're getting, like in my example, it trickles all the way down to the startup studio to the individual startup founder, and maybe you're getting $7.5 million. It would be a lot nicer to pay 20% taxes on that than 37.5% taxes on that, right? Mm-hmm. So if you end up incubating some of these companies, you do want to get stock into your hands as quickly as possible, because that gives you more options. Because if you have an opportunity to do a quick sale and it makes sense, then you can get long-term capital gains tax treatment. Now, probably even more important than that is qualified small business stock. So in the United States, again, if you hold an asset, and a piece of stock is an asset, right? So if I hold, 30% of this company, if I hold it for at least a year, now I'm in long-term capital gains tax territory. Within that category, if you hold that stock for a minimum of 5 years and you qualify, it's qualified small business stock. So there's a couple of things, on this list, but anybody can Google it, QSBS stock or qualified small business stock. You have to hold this stock for 5 years. When you acquire the stock, the business has to have less than $50 million of assets, right? Which almost all of our startups have less than $50 million of assets, right? Then when you sell that stock, the first $10 million that you individually receive is exempt from capital gains taxes, right? So in my analogy, or in my example, I'm the individual startup studio founder. I own 10% of the startup studio. The 75 million, right, comes to the startup studio. Of that, I get 7.5 million. If I've held the stock for less than a year, I could end up paying on my 7.5 million distribution. I could end up paying, 37, 38, even more in some states, taxes, right? That's a lot of taxes. If I held the stock for at least a year, I could only pay 20% taxes on my 7.5 million. If I held the stock for at least 5 years and it was otherwise qualified, I may pay no capital gains taxes at all on the entire $7.5 million. So, you have to balance that, right? It's going to cost you $1,500, maybe $2,000 to set this up. Obviously, we can't go popping off $2,000 every time a new idea comes into our head. But also there's some, this is a game of winners. You know what I mean? Like, this is a game of, like, most of these businesses fail, but the ones that win often win big. And so we need to be aware of how to optimize in tax situations where you might individually be receiving $5, $10, $15 million. And the difference between paying 37%, 37% taxes, 20% taxes, or no capital gains taxes is millions of dollars. And like, if you're going to be successful in this industry, you have to go into it with the attitude that, like, I can build a business that could be sold someday for $300 million. Like, if you don't think that you're capable of doing that, then this is not even the right industry for you to be in, because you're not going to be able to, compete with other people and raise money from sophisticated investors at the level that you need to build these big businesses. So I would say probably at a minimum, once you've incubated this idea and you've hit my desired threshold of, like, okay, we're seeing 20% month over month growth in our key metric for 6 months. At that point, like, now you need to put this into a standalone entity. You need to get yourself stock. You need to start that 5-year period, because this thing could be a rocket ship and you need to be prepared for that.
Mm-hmm. So I had a question, but now I'm thinking, is it good or not in this situation? So I thought that when a company is not yet formed, could there be an agreement between future co-founders before the formation of C-corp? But now I think that maybe they don't have to attract co-founders until they're ready to form a C-corp, because taking into account all these tax savings from if you are owning equity for a long time. So maybe when an idea is validated inside of this startup studio, they already have to form a C-corp and attract co-founders at this stage.
Well,
so, what is usually first, co-founders or C-corps are formed?
Yeah. So a key consideration in this discussion is not only traction and kind of the administrative expenses of setting up these businesses. A more fundamental consideration, something that's even more important than those, is who is actually contributing to this project. Because regardless of whether we're going to incubate this in-house for 6 months or a year in our startup studio, or we're going to set up an independent subsidiary and a Delaware C-corp right away, the thing that must happen is everybody who works on this project has to have documentation where the intellectual property that they're creating is owned by an entity, right? And that there's clear agreement about what the equity ownership of this ultimate project is going to be. So let me give a couple of examples, because this really depends on how your startup studio works, right? If your startup studio has a core group where basically everything that you need to launch the product and test the idea and gain traction, all that happens within the startup studio. All of those people who are already working for the startup studio, they're going to have, employment agreements with the startup studio that said, if I'm a developer for the startup studio and I'm working on all these different projects, all the code that I'm committing, it's either owned by the startup studio or it's owned by those individual companies, right? There's paperwork that establishes that. And it's very important, as we're working on these businesses, that it's very clear that all of these individual contributors who are working on this product, none of them individually own this. It's all clear that it's owned by some entity somewhere. And then that entity has an agreement amongst these individuals about how we divide up the equity or how we divide up the upside in this joint project that we're working in. So if you're doing everything in-house at your startup studio, everybody already has their employment agreements in place. No big deal. Incubate this thing for 6 months, a year. Once you have the traction and you're ready to incur the costs of spinning it out, it's very simple. We set up a new company. The new company issues the equity to the startup studio, and to pay for the equity, the startup studio assigns the intellectual property, right? This could be the code base, all the marketing material, the domain names that you've acquired. It assigns all of that to this new entity. And then in exchange for giving it all that intellectual property, it gets stock, right? It might get, 70, 80, 90% of the stock. If you've incubated the whole company in-house, it makes sense that the startup studio owns the whole thing because it's their project. Now you've got this new company and, this thing is starting to take off. So we need full-time team members. Maybe we need to go and attract another co-founder. We need to hire full-time people on this. And now you've got this independent company that the startup studio owns, and you can go out and, make an offer letter to maybe a CEO to give them 10% of the business to come in and run it, or to a vice president of marketing, or to a full-time developer, right? But, at no point was the ownership of the project just kind of unknown, right? Now, if your startup studio is this type that, you're the marketing force, but, you deal with a bunch of other startup founders, right? I partner with this ex-banker on my fintech app because they know the banking industry, but I'm the marketing guy. And on the SaaS company, I partner with somebody who used to do, internal accounting and finance. So they know how to build this, expense reporting app, but I help them do the marketing stuff as a startup studio. And the pillow thing, maybe I work with somebody who's a manufacturer and they're a small family business and they can make these pillows, but they really don't have any online presence. And they're trying to figure out how can I get online? How can I move my legacy family business into the digital space? Now, all of those different partners, they're not part of your startup studio. They don't have employment agreements with you. If they're doing things, you don't own that intellectual property by default. So for those cases, you could either have those individuals sign a consulting agreement with the startup studio, and it says, hey, we're going to work on this. You're going to provide consulting services on this fintech app. And in exchange for those consulting services, you recognize that the startup studio owns this intellectual property, but that when and if we spin this out into a separate business, you're going to be entitled to 25% of the equity, right? That would be one way to do it. Or you could just say, hey, we've got this, manufacturing business that makes these pillows out of, New Hampshire, right? And they're a big established business. They're not a digital business. It just makes sense for these guys to just go ahead and start a Delaware Corp right away, issue them their stock. We can kind of do all the paperwork because it seems like a little bit more formal, and they're a little bit more of a legacy business as opposed to, just some startup founder who's willing to kind of do this consulting agreement. But the point is, you should be working with counsel to make sure that, and this is the key, in the event of a dispute, right? Because founders break up. Sometimes it turns out you're not good partners for each other because it's just not a good fit, right? And in the event of a dispute, unfortunately, people remember things differently. So if you just have a verbal agreement, oh, we were going to be 50-50 partners, right? Then people remember things differently and it becomes a mess. It becomes very hard to raise money, right? No investor wants to come into a business that says, oh, I see your co-founder threatened you with a lawsuit and you have no documentation with them. And they claim that half of this application is theirs, but they never assigned the IP to you. It's you know what, guys, I'm just going to pass because this is messy and there's other opportunities for me that aren't this messy. So you always have to have proper documentation in place. All I'm saying is the proper documentation doesn't necessitate that it needs to be a brand new corporation every time you start working on something. You may be able to save that, but in general, for $1,500, you probably want to set this thing up sooner than later, especially if you're having third parties that are not part of your startup studio that are owning a significant amount of the equity and producing a significant amount of the work product and contributing to the product.
Mm-hmm. So I know that it is quite easy to form a C-corp using different services like First Base, Clerky, Stripe Atlas. And is it harder or more expensive to form it if one of co-founders is an LLC, or it is the same process? You just allocate these shares to LLC and all is the same?
Yeah, so it's not much harder. It's a little harder. I think those third-party softwares are really great. I personally am a big fan of Clerky. So like in my legal practice, whenever we're doing a new incorporation, we'll use Clerky. For anybody who's not familiar with it, you can go to their website. It's clerky.com. I'm not affiliated with them in any way other than I just think they're a good tool and I like to use them. But it's clerky.com. And so, what that is, as an example, is it's basically a legal document library. It's a bunch of form documents. It's designed for companies that want to operate in the venture capital space. So kind of fast growing technology companies that may want to raise money for people someday. And essentially you can, fill out questionnaires. It'll populate legal templates and then it'll collect digital signatures. So you can set up a business in Delaware. You can issue founder stock. You can create a stock option pool. You can hire employees. You can raise money on safes, Y Combinator's form of safes, which is a discussion for another time if you're not familiar with those, but it's a fundraising vehicle that's very streamlined and open sourced. And it's a one-time $800 charge, right? So, the magic is not in having these forms. You can go out and find places that have curated these forms. And because it's software, it's very affordable. If you can't afford $800, then, starting a business may not be the right time, for you to start a business. But usually what you want to do is you want to pair that streamlined software tool with an experienced advisor or an attorney who can give you some advice and coaching, because inevitably the software is going to say, hey, fill in this blank. And I do this every week. I start new companies, right? And it's like, there's always going to be some question you have, something that you're like, I think it's asking me this, but I just want to double check this because I want to set this company up correctly and I don't want this to come back to bite me. So those software products are really great and they should be used. And I think if people are talking to attorneys and they're not incorporating these streamlined software products into their practice, you're probably overpaying and it's probably not the right legal partner for you because, we shouldn't be paying people to do things manually that software can do instantly and perfectly and has been used, widely. So, let's make sure that we're partnering with the right people. But that being said, when you have LLCs acting as co-founders or, you have startup studios, oftentimes some of those streamlined products like Clerky, they're not designed for that. So you have to go in and customize them. You have to make some custom edits. It's not that hard, but it does require some additional manual, labor. And, what you could have done on Clerky for $1,000, with minimal customization, now maybe you're in the $1,500 to $2,000 range. So it's some extra expense. It's not a lot. The real thing is is your startup studio going to be able to produce multiple companies with traction, right? Because if it's not, then it's not worth the extra hassle and expense. So, hopefully I'm not stepping out of line here, but I'll just tell you my experience. And what I often tell people is if you want to start a startup studio and you're not going to be able to raise money right out of the gate, you're going to have to do the bootstrapped method. What I actually would encourage you to do first is start the first startup, the first project. In my case, start the pillow company first. Okay. Start the pillow company first. Make sure that you can build something that actually has some traction and does some things. And then once you've kind of got that playbook and you've got the team assembled and you know what you're doing, Then I would actually put the startup studio on top of it and then start the second company under it. Okay. So it's a little bit of a reverse thing. Now, if you're somebody who's built companies in the past, then you may not need to do that, right? You're like, hey, listen, I'm not worried about this. I'm just going to go right to the startup studio. And even if the pillow company doesn't work out, I'm going to start company 2 and 3 and 4, and one of them is going to work. That's totally fine. But if you're really conscious about like, oh, this is going to be $1,500 or $2,000 instead of $1,000, the easiest way to kind of sidestep as that is just go right into your initial first product, start it as a startup. And then once you've gotten that and it's moving and you've got a little bit of, revenue, you can pay yourself a little bit of salary. You have a little bit more free cash now to do some structuring and things and work with legal advisors. Then you can kind of set up the startup studio on top of it after the fact and then drop in other subsidiaries underneath it as you have more ideas.
So better to start an LLC or c-corp for this first startup? So first I thought that you can form LLC, start to work on the first startup, and then if you understand that it works good, then you form a c-corp and you transfer all IP and all like contracts to this new c-corp. Or it is better to start a c-corp?
I think you can do that, Max. I don't think that's a problem. I think it's like, there's multiple roads that lead to the same destination, right? Mm-hmm. So you could start out, the thing, if you want to use something like Stripe Atlas or Clerky is, they don't do LLCs. You can't start with an LLC and just have the software generate it for you. So you would have to start with a Delaware C-corp for a lot of those automated products. And then you would have to basically put the LLC on top later. Now, LLCs are not particularly complicated or expensive to start. So you could also just start with the LLC, right? Work on the product. And then once you're ready to spin it out, right? Like maybe you have the 6 months of traction that I talked about. Then you go use Clerky to set up a Delaware C-corp and maybe have a legal advisor help you modify Clerky or whatever to have the LLC be the owner. You can totally do that. Not a problem at all.
So then you can easily create an LLC parent and you can distribute or you can move these shares from C-corp to this LLC. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, you can do that. With any of these things, it depends on the context. So I think it's always good to, like I'm speaking in generalities, right? Obviously, we're not giving the listeners specific legal advice because it depends on your context. One of the things that you have to be careful about if you're going to start the Delaware C-corp and then transfer the shares to an LLC startup studio later is recall that I mentioned like, hey, you want to have this qualified small business stock because it's capital gains exempt for $10 million. If you transfer the ownership of those shares from yourself individually up to a startup studio later, it might disqualify it from that. So you would lose that eligibility.
Maybe this time will start from the scratch. Like you will need more 5 years.
Yeah, or not. Well, no. Unfortunately, it would just be you just lose the eligibility and you wouldn't be eligible for that. So as we're kind of talking through it, I think I think probably if you're very committed to the startup studio, and obviously that's the point of this podcast, but some people who are listening to this are going to realize I thought I wanted to do a startup studio, but maybe I want to do something different right now that they're learning more about it. But if you're very committed to the startup studio idea, then I think probably the best way to do it is to actually start with the LLC, put the assets there, like the intellectual property, the code base, right? You're going to set up a GitHub account. You're going to be doing code commits or whatever if you're building product. Have that all done through the LLC. The domain names can be registered in the name of the LLC. And then when you're ready to spin that out, you can spin it out using Clerky because I think that will actually protect you better from a tax perspective.
There is a term special purpose vehicle, SPV. And I encountered that this term used when discussed like subsidiary company, it is one, and the second when discussed like an entity through which investors are putting money into companies. So could you please tell about the difference? And is there any way to use SPV in funding the startup studio or in creating the subsidiaries?
Yeah. So, I think that this is terminology, and sometimes people will use terminology interchangeably and may not always use it, maybe strictly correctly. So we always have to like be a little bit careful when we're hearing people refer to like, oh, I'm using an SPV for this, but actually they might be describing a subsidiary and they're just kind of, calling it an SPV, not realizing it. So I'll tell you in my experience how I see this terminology used and what I think the correct terminology is. So SPVs, in my experience, are investment vehicles. Okay. So often what is happening is it's one of two situations, right? It's often pooling a larger amount of small investors into a single investment vehicle. And then that investment vehicle is investing in the startup or the LLC. So you could imagine, for example, if you had a startup studio and you had one large investor who wanted to put in $1.5 million, and then you had 25 smaller investors that wanted to put in $10,000 each, right? It can be a little bit of an administrative nuisance to have 25 individuals as owners in the business when they only have $10,000 of equity each. So oftentimes what we do is we'll create an SPV, which is an acronym for special purpose vehicle, right? So special purpose vehicle, it's just, it's a new entity that you can use for whatever purpose you want. But typically in this industry, what I'm describing is how they use it is we'll create a new LLC, right? And it might be called something like Startup Studio Investment LLC, right? All of those $10,000 investors will buy their position in the LLC and give the LLC their $10,000. If there's 25 of them, now that LLC has $250,000, right? Because 25 people just gave it $10,000. And then the LLC will appoint one manager who's in charge of that LLC. And then that LLC will make its investment into the startup studio. So now on your cap table of the startup studio, you have your founders, you've got your one large investor who put in 1.5 million, and you've got your SPV that put in 250,000, right? And now whenever you're dealing with the SPV, you only have to talk to that manager, and that person's in charge of like distributing information to all 25 of these small investors, making sure that they understand, what their position is, giving them their tax filings. Otherwise, you're having to field, emails and questions from 25 people, and it's often just not practical. Now, at scale, and this is for operating companies, I haven't seen startup studios do this, but at scale, there are actual like crowdfunding portals and websites like Republic, WeFunder. I've had clients who have raised money from 3,000 individual retail investors, and they might put anywhere from, $100 to $500 in. So you can imagine in that thing, it's like, well, I absolutely cannot have 3,000 of these people on my cap table. Like, it's just an administrative nightmare. So one of the services that those portals do is they create an LLC that's an SPV. They put all those people in it. They put somebody in charge of it. They do a single investment, and then they handle all the tax and accounting and back office stuff for this, group of 3,000 people who all put in, $100. So that's typically how SPVs work. Again, a special purpose vehicle. Could you create a special purpose vehicle for anything you wanted? Like, yes, but usually the terminology is applied to these pooling investment vehicles. Now, the other place where that terminology is used often is oftentimes venture capital funds will make investments outside of their normal capital structure. So for example, maybe I'm a venture capital fund and I have a $50 million fund, and my strategy is I'm trying to invest in 30 seed stage companies, right? So I have a lot of bets, relatively small checks, and I've got these 30 portfolio companies. But then I might have a pro rata right that allows me to invest my pro rata, for the next 3 rounds. So maybe I made an original $1 million investment or $1.5 million investment, but now it's 4 years later and somebody's raising at $1 billion valuation, and my pro rata is $15 million, right? Well, like, I can't put $15 million into this company out of my $50 million fund. It's too concentrated. But what I can do is I can spin up an SPV. I can go to my investor base and say, hey guys, we've got an opportunity to put $15 million into Airbnb. I can't do it out of the fund. but who wants to come in on this? And maybe one of the investors puts in 5 million and one of them puts in 1 million and one of them puts in 7 million. And we kind of cobble together this 15 million and we use this SPV to make that $15 million investment. Again, it's a special purpose vehicle because like we have a special opportunity to exercise our pro rata, but I can't do it out of my normal fund, right? Subsidiaries are different. That all that stuff that I'm describing, that's not a subsidiary, right? A subsidiary in most cases is a business, right? It's some kind of an operating business that is owned by another business, right? So a startup studio is a business, right? If it owns, a chunk of the pillow company, now you've got a business that's owned by a business. So the one is a subsidiary of the other. Generally speaking, we use the term subsidiary when a business owns a majority interest in another business, right? You could imagine, like, let's say that you are, you're a startup and you go and you're raising money. And I've had this, experience many times. Like there's many corporate venture arms that invest in startups. Maybe Dell Ventures is investing in you, or Airbus Ventures, or Qualcomm Ventures. I mean, there's tons of these, and they buy 5% of your business. Well, now I'm a business that's owned by another business, but just because Qualcomm bought 5% of my business doesn't make me their subsidiary. If they bought 51% of my business, now they kind of control us. Now it looks like we're their subsidiary. So generally speaking, it's this control by another business that usually is a subsidiary. So, for a startup studio, if you're owning 30 or 40% of these startup portfolio companies and you've got other co-founders who own the other, 60%, it's probably not really a subsidiary. It's probably a portfolio company. But the only real reason where it matters if it's is this a subsidiary or not is in accounting, because you may have to report consolidated financial statements and have some reporting for accounting purposes and for when you file your tax returns. But mostly when we're talking about subsidiaries, we're not, talking to our friends about the tax filings that we're about to make. We're kind of really talking about, is this another business that we control or not?
Okay, Jared, do you think that there are some other legal or tax aspects we could consider for the founders and stakeholders if they want to start a startup studio?
Yeah, I think so. I think, there's a couple of things to consider. So whenever we're talking about taxes, there's really kind of two buckets of taxes that we're thinking about. There's the income taxes that you pay on your wages, right? Because if you're a startup studio and you've raised $2 million, you might be drawing a salary of, $120,000, $150,000 a year, right? Because you're there showing up every day doing a job and you have investors and it's you need to get paid, right? People have bills to pay. They need to get paid. So those are your income taxes. Those income taxes are based on where you live and where you work, right? So if I'm a startup studio founder, and let's say one of my founders lives in New York, one of them lives in San Francisco, and one of them lives in Berlin, the guy who lives in New York pays his income taxes in New York and in the United States. And the woman who lives in San Francisco pays her taxes in California and the United States. And the person who lives in Berlin pays his taxes in, Berlin and in Germany, right? Based on the wages that they get. The United States is one of the few jurisdictions that imposes international tax regime, meaning if you're a U.S. citizen or if you're a U.S. green card holder, you have to pay U.S. taxes no matter where you live, right? So let's say that, the person who lives in Berlin has a U.S. green card, but they're living in Berlin, for the time being. They have to pay their Berlin and Germany taxes first, right? And then the U.S. will say, okay, now in the U.S. you would have owed us, let's say you would have owed us $30,000 in taxes. And then if they're well, I already paid $28,000 in taxes in Germany. So then you just pay the balance to the United States. It would be $2,000 in that case. But you would have to file a tax return in the US in that case. Again, that need to file your tax return in the US, it's not because you're an owner of a US business. It's not because your startup studio is in the US or you have US investors. In that case, it would be because you are individually a US taxpayer, because either you're a US citizen you're a U.S. green card holder, or you're living and working in the United States, right? So if you're not those things, if you live in Berlin and you're not a green card holder and you're not a U.S. citizen, you're not a U.S. taxpayer, you don't have to worry about filing U.S. tax returns, okay, on these $120,000 salary you're drawing. Now, the other bucket is like taxes with respect to your equity. So this is my example of like, hey, $75 million is coming in. Maybe all three of us are getting 7.5 million, and then we've got other people involved who are getting the rest, right? We already talked about this to some degree, but like we want to think about when we get distributions, making sure that we're getting capital gains distributions and not ordinary income tax distributions. And if we can, we're getting qualified small business stock distributions. Those are considerations for when you're setting the business up. They're not considerations for when you get paid. By the time you get paid, like you're in one bucket or the other, right? So it's part of the setup process and thinking and talking to appropriate advisors around, hey, I live in Berlin now, but I think by the time we start selling these businesses, which could be in 2 or 3 years, I plan on relocating to the United States. So I think by that point, I'm going to be a U.S. taxpayer. Let's make sure that I'm also eligible for QSBS stock, or I'm, you know what I mean? Like you have to kind of think ahead about, hey, if I'm going to get $75 million at some point, where am I going to be living and who am I going to be reliable to pay taxes to? And have I optimized my situation for that jurisdiction? Because they have different rules.
Do you think that if a person wants to move to the US, if he creates LLC, then C-corps under this LLC, so they are eligible for this, how to say, tax return or
yeah, I think they are. I think individuals who live abroad are eligible for qualified small business stock. Okay. The question really becomes who holds the stock. In our example, you individually don't hold the qualified small business stock. Your startup studio holds that stock, and you hold an LLC membership interest in the startup studio. So you're an indirect kind of beneficiary of the stock. But these startup studios can hold qualified small business stock if they're structured correctly. So, for example, I do a little bit of angel investing. I mean, it's not my primary job, but obviously I represent a lot of companies and help them raise money. So from time to time, I'll have opportunities to put money into companies. I do my investing through an S-corp. That's the structure that I use. And so, there's a lot of different ways that you can structure this, but like S-corps are eligible to hold qualified small business stock. LLCs can hold qualified small business stock. And so, for me, I live in the United States, so I'm a U.S. taxpayer. And so it's important for me to make sure that these potential revenue sources through capital gains taxes have those tax advantages. The one thing that sometimes people ask me about is like dividends. Well, what about like if the LLC gets $75 million, could we pay a dividend, right? Or let's say I'm a startup studio that has the that has the desire to raise money from institutional investors. So maybe it's not a good fit for my startup studio to be an LLC, because I mentioned that institutional investors typically don't invest in LLCs. So my startup studio is actually a C corporation, right? That C corporation gets $75 million. Can it pay out that money to me as a dividend, right? And the reality is, it's usually just not a tax efficient way to distribute capital. Most dividends in the United States are taxed as if they were ordinary income. So I'm like talking about like, okay, now we're back to 37% taxes instead of 20% taxes. There are some exceptions. There are some qualified dividends that you can do that actually qualify for capital gains taxes. But it happens so infrequently in my practice and kind of the venture capital ecosystem that like, I don't even know what the rules are for that. You know what I mean? It doesn't even come up because people just don't do dividends. Typically speaking, what we do is anytime there's free cash flow, we're usually taking that and reinvesting it into the business to grow. Or in the case of a startup studio that's an LLC, if the LLC holds $75 million at the end of the year, it doesn't pay taxes. So all the individuals have to pay the taxes on its behalf. So the LLC is pretty much forced to distribute the cash to those people because like you're going to get a tax bill on behalf of the LLC and they have to give you money to pay it because it could be millions of dollars. So in general, I would say, I wouldn't kind of spend too much time thinking about dividends at either the startup studio level or the operating company level. Practically speaking, there's better, more tax efficient ways to get that money to people.
Okay, thank you, Jared, for joining the video podcast and answering all those questions. So I think we have really complex content about creating a startup studio, and this will be helpful for all people who want to create multiple businesses.
Absolutely. Best of luck, everyone. If you're interested, you can find my contact information at presidio.legal. That's our website. You can reach out to our info page there, and you can get connected to one of our attorneys if this is something that you're interested in speaking about to a legal advisor in more detail to talk about your specific situation. Cool. Thanks so much, Max.
Thank you very much.
Max Pog builds a startup studio.